Welcome back. Now, all parents know the attraction of video games to their children, whether on a games console, PC, or even on the phone. But how much gaming is enough, and can a healthy obsession turn into an addiction?
Yeah, joining us this morning is addiction counsellor with the Rutland Centre, John Byrne. You're very welcome,
morning,
John.
John.
And
thank you. Good morning.
What we want to really establish here is we don't want to scaremonger here. We want to get the difference between what's a normal kids that loves playing their games but is perfectly healthy, normal every other way, and what is addictive behaviour. So maybe take us through what is addiction and how it can manifest itself in gaming and in consoles.
Okay. That's a good place to start, because often we find at the Rutland that there's a misunderstanding of what is addiction and addictive process. So what we would tend to tell people is that addiction is the term that's used to describe a cycle of compulsive behaviour that is ultimately self-destructive and, most importantly, out of control of the individual. So when you start from the place of using that definition, then it doesn't really matter hugely what the compulsive behaviour is. It's actually the process behind the behaviour that's important. And we would find that most of the people who present for treatment at the Rutland, the process is really very much about trying to avoid or escape on some level from a reality of life that is too difficult to cope with. So the addictive behaviour starts off perhaps being recreational, such as having a few drinks on a Friday night, or maybe, recreational drug use, or, internet activity, or whatever it happens to be. The behaviour, like I say, is not so important. But the individual notices over time that, hey, this feels pretty good. It's an opportunity to leave my worries outside the door and maybe slip away from whatever it is that's challenging me in life. Absolutely.
Well, as parents, John, and the issue that we're talking about this morning, in particular gaming with kids, I think what we'd like to get to is how do we keep an eye on it, and how do we keep an eye on it reaching a level where we know enough is enough. They can have 1 hour a day or half an hour a day. What should we be looking for as parents?
Well, it's an interesting point, because I was talking to some of my colleagues yesterday about this, and again, gaming as an addictive phenomenon is not something that is as yet presenting to the services. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist.
Yes.
In fact, what we were saying is that in all probability, because of the typical profile of a gamer, who will tend to be a teenager into adolescent, into young adult perhaps, that their lifestyle is such that it's conducive to engaging in a behavior, in gaming behaviour excessively, and people wouldn't necessarily notice that it slipped into addictive process. So if you take, for example, a typical 14, 15, 16-year-old who may well be withdrawing, may well be isolating themselves, may well be spending what would be considered to be excessive periods of time inside in their bedroom playing games. They don't.
That's actually one of the first things that we see on this little graphic. Withdrawing from relationships. It's isolating yourself is the first one.
And isolation is a key theme in addictive process right across the board, because the individual tends to build a stronger relationship with the addictive behaviour, and as a consequence then they start to withdraw from intimate relationships in particular.
Some of those are sort of follow on from that then, in terms of negative mental health and tiredness. And there's an interesting one just though at the end there, child protection, especially with younger kids who are into, because gaming forums and the internet can be a place where grooming can go on. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, and that's a very significant concern. I listened on one of the radio shows during the week there to a young lady talking very articulately about how you can be a 47-year-old from Texas pretending to be a 14-year-old from Reno on a game, and the individual playing the games, because they just don't know whether the individual's identity is true. So there are very, very real child protection concerns, and it is worthy of concern from a parental perspective.
In terms of warning signs, you've touched on it, that difficulty of identifying what's a normal teenager who just likes playing their games but has healthy relationships, in their life, and even within gaming, playing games with friends, and where it is an addiction, which is an underlying maybe issue around depression.
Well, again, you see some of the characteristics of adolescence are also similar to characteristics that are present. I mean, if you
withdrawing from upstairs.
Moodiness, irritability, withdrawal, isolation. Some could say that's a moody teenager being a teenager, but it's also consistent with the early stages of addictive process. So what we would say is that it really boils down to knowing your kid, and it really boils down to knowing your child's ability to be resilient in the face of whatever challenges that may be presenting for them in life, trying to facilitate them to be open and expressive in relationships, trying to notice what's going on for them. They may be experiencing... I mean, look, adolescence is a horrible time, right? It's a really, really difficult time in life for anybody.
Yeah.
So who wouldn't want to escape from it? You know, so it's about being with your child insofar as you possibly can, and engaging them and trusting that they will be able to tell you what's going on and teaching them coping strategies so that they don't have to escape from life in order to be able to do it.
As a parent, I mean, is it just a matter of, and maybe you relate to this, I don't know, but just the cycle of life repeating itself? Because when I was a 10-year-old or 12-year-old, is it that thing of just stop playing that game and get out into the street? You know, like it would have been Sabuji or whatever it was, because we hadn't got them back 20, 30 years ago. Is it? I find myself repeating the same things that my dad said to me. Would you not just put that down and go out and play for a minute?
Well, you know, there is an element of that, because I think we've slipped into a situation culturally in one generation, and I think you're spot on there. When we were kids, we were off out and playing in the fresh air for hours and hours.
Because we nothing else to do.
My own kids keep horses, and that's part of the reason that we do that. And we make sure that they get out and take responsibility. They're limited in the amount of time that they can use on the computers, and you know, we monitor it fairly closely and talk to them a lot about what they're doing and who they're doing it with and so on. So you know, old-fashioned play outside with a hurl or a football or doing whatever it is that is traditional play is always.
And that's one of those, you know, sort of tips for parents in terms that we had up on screen there, in terms of limiting their time, being in control of it, and making sure it's part of like a balanced sort of you know, recreations across the board.
And of course the challenge is, I mean, children are adolescents in the making, and the day of your 14th birthday you're only 48 months from being an adult, so you do have to empower the kids to take responsibility and let them out insofar as you possibly can. So it's a delicate balance to empower and support kids.
I'm thinking ahead, John, to next week, as most schools are on a mid-term break. I know now that the lads have a week off school, and it's trying to think of things to do with them, and just try not to be that lazy parent where just for the sake of quietness, I let them have a couple of hours on the PlayStation. How do we get over that and get on with it? Do you know what I mean? How do you present an alternative to them?
Look, parenting is hard work. Parenting is hard work. I mean, there is a corresponding issue that we haven't touched on, which is also important, which is the children's ability to be with themselves, to actually sit with themselves and be comfortable in their own skin. So, you know, there's a significant rise in the last number of years with children and adolescents with attention disorders, for example. And there is an argument to suggest that that's at least in part because of the gaming culture and the constant stimulation that children receive from a very young age, and their inability to actually sit with themselves when they're not being stimulated by technology. So, you know, get them back into reading books, get them back into playing traditional board games, get them back into activities such as playing hurling and football and old-fashioned games that require...
But not being afraid, I guess, not being an old dinosaur saying, you know, because they are a part of modern children's lives. And just as we necessarily mightn't relate as much, and they can have social interaction within them.
I think what frightens the life out of parents is that it's that Pandora's box of the internet.
It's all evil life is there.
But again, a critical issue, particularly for people with chemical addiction, is the requirement for instant gratification. And, you know, there is a link there between computer
this is what, just to wrap up then, John, and the first thing asked is how to separate sort of a healthy interest in something like gaming and addictive. It comes back down to anything to do with addiction, doesn't it? Fundamental underlying problems, and trying to identify them in young people.
Yes. What I would say is the key in terms of people who are susceptible to addictive process is vulnerability, and the vulnerability tends to come from struggling or having an inability to cope with the challenges of life. So be with your kids, notice them, notice if there are things going on for them that may be causing challenges to them, bullying, just the transitions in adolescence, relationship issues, those kinds of things, and facilitate them to find coping strategies other than escapism. Would be the
escapism is the word, isn't it? John Byrne from the Rutland Centre, thanks for joining us this morning.
Very interesting. My pleasure. Thank you.